You know how sometimes people say something and there's a meaning beyond the literal interpretation of their words?
I think this is where the context of the conversation is rather important. You also have to consider how well you know the person, what you were talking about to begin with, and whether the person was using idioms to make a point.
When we use language, we very often mean stuff beyond the literal interpretation of our words.
Or, in some cases, our actions, which can then be determined to be in context or not, or have a meaning or have a different meaning entirely, by a judge.
So, with all of that in mind, it's important to know that the phrase, "it's okay to be white," is racist as shit.
Okay, so two things. Firstly, I did cut out about 30 seconds of audio as it was utterly irrelevant. And also, even if you heard it and then heard that statement about it's okay to be white being racist as shit, it would just sound ridiculous. And second, the term "it is okay to be white" is not racist. There are fringe groups that have taken it, and of course they spin it and others interpret it as racist because of the political leaning of those who would then say it is okay to be white. However, there is nothing inherently wrong with someone's skin colour. Therefore, it is okay to be white. It is okay to be black. It is okay to be blue. It is okay to be non-binary colour. I know that's a bit more of a ridiculous one. I'm sure one day it will become a thing, but I thought I'd just throw it in now. And if no one's already said it, I'm going to copyright it.
I know it may sound innocent to some of you, but it's a dog whistle.
I don't see how saying it is okay to be white is a dog whistle. And for those that don't know, a dog whistle is when someone sends a coded message. Something that means something else, essentially. But I'm sure you, Riley Justin Apple, will explain to us soon enough what you mean.
It's a phrase that would fly under most people's radar, but would signal to a certain group of people, in this case, white supremacists, that the person saying this phrase is one of them.
Unless you found out the new entry password for the KKK meetings, I'm gonna have to call bullshit on this. Either that or put a tinfoil hat on myself, because all of this sounds like a conspiracy theory. I don't suppose you have proof for this now, do you? Or have you derived this from your many investigations into 4chan?
The phrase, "it's okay to be white," recently gained notoriety thanks to the garbage can of the internet, 4chan.
I honestly thought for a second you were going to then pigeonhole 4chan users as alt-right or white supremacists, but thankfully you haven't done that, which is good, because honestly, pigeonholing is a shit move. Now I do want to defend 4chan for a minute, because while you call them the garbage can, they did manage to convince a bunch of girls to pee for equality. I'm pretty sure free bleeding came from them as well, which is, let's face it, disgusting and hilarious. I was waiting for poop for equality if that's not already happened.
White nationalists and neo-Nazis on that site designed the phrase specifically to try and piss off people on the left and make white people look like victims.
I'll be honest, if that was the intended goal of 4chan, I don't think it worked. That said, there is nothing wrong with a white person being a victim. They can, after all, be victims of racism, whether you want to admit it or not. And this did, whether you want to admit it or not, also start many discussions about the subject of being white, which I think was quite productive, certainly on the internet, with those that I'm sure you would deem to be alt-right or neo-Nazi.
They wanted a phrase that could embolden white nationalists while appearing innocent to the average person. They wanted to make the public sympathetic to their imaginary cause of white people as a group being oppressed. They desperately wanted to be victim.
If there is something inherently wrong with the idea of a white person being a victim, and I say white person, not white people as a whole, because I'd rather treat the individual than the entire group. Because let's face it, white is very broad. Culturally, very broad. When you treat the individual and their issue, say for example a white person has been a victim of racism, you then, if you want to defeat that person, prove to them that they were not the victim of a racist attack, have to treat the individual as exactly that, and use suitable evidence that is not skewed by feminist rhetoric, to make it quite clear to them. And I say feminist rhetoric because it has been debunked so many times, it's almost embarrassing now. Proves to that person that they are in fact not a victim of racism. If you are unable to do that, then you only give that person cause to believe that they were in fact the victim of a racist attack. You're welcome to now insert some privileged comment here if you want.
And frustratingly, they've kind of succeeded.
Yay.
Flyers with the phrase have been plastered around colleges in the US. Some asshole was actually paid money to give an "it's okay to be white" speech at the University of Connecticut, and white nationalist Tucker Carlson cried about it during his segment on Fox News.
As I earlier stated, I think the "it's okay to be white" thing did in fact stimulate quite a lengthy amount of conversation amongst many YouTubers. I thought it was quite fascinating. Second, the asshole that got to speak at Connecticut on the subject of "it is okay to be white," or "is it okay to be white," was Lucian Wintridge. And I believe someone stole his speech. I believe that's a crime in your country. And thirdly, Tucker Carlson is a conservative political commentator, not alt-right, or a neo-Nazi for that matter, in case you want to add that as well to the list of inevitable charges for wrongthink.
But this phrase actually has an even deeper history than just racist asshats gathering on 4chan. The Anti-Defamation League has found much earlier usages of the phrase, including in a 2001 song by a white power band, in white supremacist flyers from 2005, and a KKK member tweeted the phrase in 2012.
Ooh, that's a lot of isolated instances you have there, from such a credible and reliable source like the ADL that want to censor YouTubes entirely. This must mean there's some kind of correlation, right? No, they are, after all, like I stated, isolated instances.
If this is your first time coming across the phrase, just know that it isn't the first time for Nazis and white nationalists. For them, it's somewhat of a slogan. It's a way for them to make themselves politically correct in a world that rightfully wants them to fuck off.
You know, you've developed quite the potty mouth over the years. It's almost as if your patience is starting to wear out. Now, to address what you said about society rightfully wanting them to fuck off, this shows an incredible weakness on your part, and also an assumption. You assume that people at large would want them to fuck off. Now, they are also not Nazis. Neo-Nazi, possibly. White nationalist, possibly. Not Nazi. But the weakness I earlier stated shows to me that you can't defeat the idea. It tells me you are not good enough. If you can't defeat a white nationalist on ideas, and then again I don't expect you to be able to. You two are on totally different sides of the street, but you're arguing about race from different perspectives, which makes you, to me, absolute idiots. Allow me to give you a very simple rundown of what I think about race and how I think everyone else should interpret it. Clears throat. I do not now, nor will I ever give a flying fuck about race. But if you want to make race an issue, or denigrate discussion down to race to try and score some points, you are my problem, and I will defeat your idea with evidence, of course evidence. And if that doesn't work, then I'll just destroy the whole bloody planet in 2020 with Magog as I had already planned to in the first place. We'll just escalate it a little.
It's just like, if you consider yourself to be against racism, then you should probably want to distance yourself from a phrase that has deep roots in white supremacy and neo-Nazism.
Kind of like how people are distancing themselves from the label feminism because of the actions of feminists or isolated instances of feminists acting in a negative way in the name of feminism. Kind of like how a new label for liberal has come up because liberal has been tarnished beyond belief. I believe the label is liberalist, owned by Andy Rees-Swarsky, I believe?
Like, okay, literally, word for word, with no context, it's okay to be white is true. But knowing that it has more meaning behind it, knowing that it's a racist dog whistle, that should be enough for you to say, no, fuck this, fuck that phrase, it's racist, and I don't want to have anything to do with it.
While I'm glad you understand the sentiment and agree that it is in fact okay to be white, which I think is mind-blowing that you'd even say that in the first place, I tend to disagree with the latter part of that statement. Because to distance yourself from a simple turn of phrase, which is what it is, it's not that powerful. I think people have elevated neo-Nazis a bit too much here. But it does mean that those people who ordinarily aren't neo-Nazi but would say it is okay to be white without wanting to be ostracized would now have to look for a new label. And I don't think people need to do that. You need to fight the idea head on, defeat it, and take it back. Kinda like liberal.
It's really not that hard. Don't give these people the time of day. Don't get into an argument about whether or not it's okay to be white, because that's not the discussion.
While you say it is okay to be white is not the discussion, by not talking about it, even with those that do say it that you would call a neo-Nazi, a fascist, a racist, a white nationalist, or whatever, you are allowing the issue to grow, fester, stew, and exponentially grow, to the point where a discussion will inevitably have to be had, which you could have easily dealt with at the start.
We're only saying that the phrase, it's okay to be white, is racist as shit.
Without using those instances earlier mentioned by the ADL, could you actually prove the term is in itself racist? Or would you struggle and then hide behind the ADL, a company that is, quite frankly, an absolute joke?
And what's frustrating about this is that the racists who hide behind this phrase know that context matters. They know exactly what bullshit they're pulling. Because when they see the phrase Black Lives Matter, they infer a whole lot of context about that phrase. Because taken literally, Black Lives Matter literally cannot be offensive. It's just a statement of fact, and if you disagree with it, you're saying that black lives don't matter, which would be a really shitty thing to argue.
I don't think anyone would argue that black lives do in fact matter. It's the movement and the people involved in the movement and the celebrities that have endorsed it and the criminals that lead it. The actions, after all, speaking louder than the words, that matter, so yes, context is key here. The term, there's nothing wrong with it. But the people acting in its name are a problem, and it's the same with it's okay to be white. The difference here is you're inconsistent in your stance. You seem to have a bit of a blind spot with darker-skinned people, but you seem to be okay with getting rid of any kind of terminology that would make white people feel less like they're being ostracized by society at large, by the heavily liberal media, and disingenuous fucks on the internet.
But conservatives and white nationalists are often offended by the phrase Black Lives Matter because the context they take from that phrase is, and therefore white lives don't matter. That's why people get so offended over the phrase Black Lives Matter, because they infer context from it.
And with that assumed piece of codswallop, because that's what it is, assumed, we're done here. I don't have the patience to go through an entire Riley Dennis video because I'd have to cut it up into about 1,000 pieces and ramble on for hours. I'm not doing that. By the way, it wasn't just conservatives who were arguing that Black Lives Matter meant that white lives didn't matter. If anything, this stimulated a discussion about how important racial identity was, and I think that's more fascinating, but you seem to have yet again developed a blind spot for it. So with all of this done, I'm done. Tomorrow, if anyone is interested, at 9:30 PM GMT on the Cthulhu-Kin and Friends show, I will be streaming a response to Prime Minister's questions. If you want, feel free to join me and listen to me rant about politics in my country. So I hope you all have a lovely day, and thank you all for listening.